can't tell you how much of a delight it is to be back in Ames and to be here at my alma mater. And the weather is just fantastic, as it always is at Ames. And thank you for that. And it's nice to see all you folks here. Thank you for coming on this evening. We had an opportunity this afternoon to meet with some students who were thinking careers or whatever in sociology and anthropology. And I can assure you that this country is in good hands with these young people. They are nice, they are thoughtful, and they are committed to doing good things. So Iowa State should be proud of what it is doing with its youngsters, and the students coming are well prepared to contribute to the next generation. David Plath in the back is the producer of this film that we are about to see. I'm grateful to him because there are lots of things that he could have done to me in this film, but as many reviewers have said, it is a warm film, and I am delighted. I have no qualms about any of it, some of it embarrassing, and we'll look forward to your comments when you are done seeing this. So let's crank it up.
As you look at sort of the transition from traditional to modernity over a 50-year period of time, what's been the major consequence? Can you sort of capture what's been the major consequence? You started out with families. In 1961, you were really interested, as I understand it, in families. But really beyond that, I see that it's gone off in another direction. So I wondered if you could sort of summarize what have been sort of the major consequences of moving from an agrarian to an industrial culture there?
Great question, Paul. Is this thing on? Great question. And it's a question I'm asking every day, most of the day long. The biggest thing for me is the emergence of car culture. And what car culture has done has taken the community from, as the film, this beautiful, warm film that David Plath has done, from not just an isolated village, it wasn't, but most of the social action happened within that community. Cars have taken them out, so the social universe has expanded dramatically. In 1962, when I went to the first wedding I saw, I knew virtually everybody there or how they were related to the couple getting married. I went to a wedding a few years ago. I knew almost nobody. There were 211 people at the wedding, and I knew the kin, I knew the neighbors, but there were a whole range of people that I didn't know. So globalization has taken them outside the village and broadened their social networks, I think, to the good. The losers probably are grandma. Because in the old days, the kids' parents would be sitting with grandma at the kotatsu, this place where the family would congregate and stay warm and eat, and this kind of thing. So people were talking with grandma. Now the kids are in their own study rooms, the parents are off in their cars, grandma is isolated.
I enjoyed this video. I haven't learned much at all about the Japanese and the culture other than what we get in television, which is usually wrong. I was reading an article by, and I don't remember his name, I wanted to bring it. He was an Air Force general in the Japanese Air Force, and he won an essay contest and his title of his essay was Japan an Aggressor Nation? And his idea, the thesis was that Japan was reacting in a defensive manner when the war came on, the Second World War, rather than as an aggressor nation. And he supposedly showed that Korea economics increased manifold because of the Japanese desire for their products and things like that. For the people that you talk to, if the subject came up, did they consider their previous ancestors' works in the Second World War as an aggressor nation, or were they as a defensive nation? Does that, have I expressed that question properly?
This is a major thing in Japanese political consciousness now, and the conservative right is pushing that point and receiving a huge amount of criticism from others in the society. And there has been, one of the great things about the internet and the new technology is that people are aware of arguments coming from around the world. So the isolation of Japan intellectually, where the conservative right can push that argument, no longer works. And the young Japanese are now aware, even if it's not being taught in the school, they are seeing on the internet and other places a different kind of argument. And what you won't see, this is one of my favorite stories by one of the people, actually the guy I took the coffee can to. We had a wonderful excursion to a hot spring resort, and we're sitting up in his room enjoying the fellowship. And he said, "Brown, you know, if it hadn't been for the bomb, I wouldn't be here now." You won't see that in the press. That doesn't fit with this conservative right argument. And the diversity that is in Japanese population is huge, 127 million of them. So I wouldn't take those kinds of arguments as being representative of the country as a whole. But this guy's a better expert on Japan than I am, so I'll let him talk about that.
As usual, he's dodging the issues. Let me respond in this way, not so much to the present day scene, because Keith has got it right there. But over 50 years, I've almost never had people want to even talk about the war. In the very earliest years, the late 1950s, early 1960s, Keith and I both had this experience when there were still former active military men around. And occasionally they would seek us out to apologize for the war. People ask me sometimes today, well, isn't there anti-Americanism in Japan? Basically, no. Basically, over 50 years, I've heard more apologies for the war than I have people saying anything anti-American. And for me, a subtext in this film is it's not a major feature, it's not a major theme, but behind it, and perhaps you caught some of it, is this. In 1945, the U.S. and Japan had just finished one of the bloodiest, most hideous wars in our history. People like Keith and I, very naive Americans, went a few years later. And what have we found? Basically, the Japanese we met said to us, not necessarily so much in words, but in actions, let's put that war behind us. Whoever was responsible for it, let's get rid of it. Let's not study war no more. And we have had, after one of the worst wars in American history, 50 years of really good relationships across the Pacific. And if I have a take-home message for the evening, I like to think a little glimmer of hope. If that can happen across the Pacific between East Asians and Americans, maybe it can also happen between Middle Eastern peoples and the United States. peace can happen if people give it a chance. I know that's not what the film is directly about, but that's part of what Keith and I have found over 50 years of involvement in Japan. Let me give you, it's an extreme example, but a very concrete example that I ran into 20 years ago. My wife and I had gone to coastal communities in central Japan to start some field research. And a few weeks into the period there, my wife broke a crown on her tooth. Very painful. So I asked one of our neighbors, introduced me to a dentist. We hadn't had any reason to see a dentist until then. And they introduced me to one in the next town up the way. We went to the dentist's office, and in Japan very often there'd be 3 or 4 dental chairs in one big open room, and the people waiting to get in are sitting there too. It's a public kind of thing. We walk in, there are people in the chairs, there are people waiting. We're immediately taken over to the head dentist himself, and he takes us into his own private little office, and it's just a cubbyhole. Sits us down, somebody brings us tea. And we even chit-chat a little bit, people sitting out there in the dental chair. And he looked at my wife's tooth, and he said, I think she needs a gold crown. I thought, ooh, gold crown. I didn't know any dental insurance. I said, okay, you're the doctor. If she need a gold crown, you need a gold crown. He said, but I'm not going to charge you anything. I said, whoa, wait a minute. As politely as I could say it, I said, look, I expect to be here for many months, maybe for off and on for several years doing research. I don't want to get a reputation as one of those Americans, and there are some, who poach on the goodwill of Japanese. I don't want, He said, you don't understand. I was just a little boy in 1945 when that war ended. America won that war. Japan at that time, as many of you probably know, was desperately in need of food. He said, you won the war. You could have just let us starve. You sent shiploads of food to us. And this is 1984, almost 40 years later. He said, ever since then, I've wanted to say thank you, America. And now that you're here, I have a chance to say thank you, America. It's an extreme example, but this to me is the example of the relationships that Japanese have gone out of their way to cultivate with Americans for the last 50 years.